Left! It's sagging on the left! Hurry, William, it's giving way!
One more. Just. One more and it holds. And it held.
It held.
Tonight, everything they built together hung from a single rope in the dark.
By the 9th night of the Ashcroft storm, the Duchy of Ravensmoor had disappeared entirely. Winds screamed across the frozen fields at more than 70 miles an hour. The temperature had dropped to 34 below. Snow swallowed the gatehouse, buried the stable doors, and erased every road leading in or out.
Inside the old storehouse, a support beam split with a sound like a gunshot.
William Ashcroft was already inside the attic space when it happened, his hands raw, his breath freezing before it left his mouth. Below him, in the courtyard, Mariana held the rope steady against the wind, her voice the only thing keeping him anchored to what was left of the roof. If the beam gave way completely, the grain stores would fall into the drifts below, and with them, every ounce of food standing between 6 people and starvation. The children huddled by the hearth in the main house, too frightened to cry anymore. A steward who had mocked William's arrival just weeks earlier now stood frozen at the doorway, watching a disgraced duke risk his life for a woman who owed him nothing. The rope went taut. Then it went still.
9 weeks earlier, William Ashcroft had arrived at these gates with nothing but a broken cart and 2 starving children. How was it that the survival of an entire duchy now depended on whether he could keep his grip?
Late in November, in a winter the old villagers would later swear was the coldest anyone had lived to describe, William Ashcroft came walking up the frozen road to Ravensmoor with his 6-year-old daughter clinging to his shoulder and his young son trailing silently beside the cartwheel, too proud to ask how much farther they had left to go. His cloak was still fine enough to hint at the title he'd once held, fur-trimmed, gold-threaded. The mark of a man who had built half the great houses in the region before he lost everything else. Now it hung heavy with frost, and beneath it he carried nothing but a folio of old architectural drawings and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Mariana was in the courtyard when she saw them. She'd buried her husband 2 winters back and buried her trust in strangers not long after. She gathered her children against her worn burgundy skirts and watched the fallen duke close the distance between them, his hand finally rising, palm open, not in command, but in a plea. "Feed my heirs through winter," he said, "and I'll save your crumbling duchy." She didn't answer right away. She only studied his face, the exhaustion behind his eyes, the way his children looked at her like she might be the last warm thing left in the world. And somewhere beneath her wariness, a question took root that she wouldn't be able to shake for the rest of the season. What kind of man offers everything he has left to a stranger, unless he's already lost everything he was trying to protect? If you've ever wondered what's left of a person once title, home and pride have all been stripped away, stay close. Because what Mariana was about to discover about the man standing in her courtyard would change the fate of Ravensmoor long before the storm ever came. She gave him 1 week to prove it. The road to Ravensmoor had long since disappeared beneath the snow, but William Ashcroft kept walking anyway. He had nothing left to navigate by except memory, the shape of a hill here, the bend of a frozen stream there, landmarks from a life that no longer belonged to him. His daughter's small arms were locked around his neck, her face buried against his collar to escape the wind. His son walked beside the cart, one hand gripping the splintered wood, refusing even now, even half frozen to splintered wood, refusing even now, even half frozen to be carried like a child. The gates of the estate rose out of the white like the ribs of something dying. William stopped, looked up at the crumbling stonework, the sagging roofline of the gatehouse, the ice creeping down cracks that should have been mortared shut a decade ago. Whoever ran this place, they were losing badly. And he recognized the particular flavor of that loss because he'd tasted it himself. He knocked. It took 3 tries before the door groaned open, and the widow Mariana stood in the gap, a lantern raised. Her children pressed close behind her skirts like they, too, had learned that strangers meant danger before they'd learned much else. "We have nothing to give," she said, before he'd spoken a word. "Whatever you're selling, whatever you're begging for, we have nothing. I'm not asking for charity." William's voice was steady, though his hands were shaking from the cold, or something closer to shame. "I'm offering a trade." Her eyes moved over him, the fine cut of a cloak gone threadbare at the seams, the fur collar matted with frost, the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once commanded rooms and now stood begging at a gate. "A trade," she repeated flat. "I build things," he said. "I fix things." Foundation. Grain storage, water systems, heating flues. I trained as an architect before I was anything else, and I've kept half the great houses of this province standing longer than they had any right to. He shifted his daughter higher on his hip. She whimpered, and the sound seemed to cost him something physical. "Give my children milk. Give us a corner to sleep in through this winter. And I will save whatever is left of this duchy before the frost finishes it." Mariana said nothing for a long moment. The wind howled through the gate behind him, and somewhere in the dark, a shutter banged loose against its frame as if the house itself were arguing on his behalf. "You're the Ashcroft Duke," she said finally. Not a question. "I was," William said. "I'm not sure what that title's worth anymore. Less than a sack of grain most days." She looked at his children again, the girl's hollow cheeks. The boy's eyes far too old for his age, and something in her hardened expression cracked. Just slightly, just enough. "1 week," she said. "Prove you're worth the milk you're asking for. Fail, and you walk before the roads close for good." William exhaled, and it might have been relief. It might have been dread. Even he couldn't tell anymore where one ended and the other began. 1 week, he agreed. She stepped back to let them in, and the door shut behind them with a sound like a verdict. By morning, William understood exactly how much danger he'd walked into, not from Mariana, but from the estate itself. He moved through Ravensmoor, in the grey dawn light with the eye of a man reading a body for the disease already killing it. The central hearth, half collapsed, was bleeding heat out through a cracked flue instead of into the halls. The grain stores, stacked in a low stone building whose foundation had shifted enough that damp was creeping up through the floor. Rot already blooming pale and silent in the corners of the sacks. Worse, far worse, the roof beams of the main storehouse groaned under the snow load they were never built to bear. "You've been losing a third of your harvest to rot every year," William said, when Mariana found him crouched in the storehouse, running his palm along a beam gone soft at the joint. "Maybe more." "We manage," she said, arms crossed, guarding the words as they cost her something to admit otherwise. "You're not managing. You're surviving one bad winter away from losing everything." He straightened, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something in his exhaustion gave way to purpose. The old William, the one who used to walk construction sites with the certainty of a man who'd never once doubted his own hands. "The flue redirect is simple. 2 days if I have help. The grain store needs the foundation raised before the spring thaw, or you'll lose the whole harvest to mould regardless of how cold it gets." And this he pressed his palm flat against the beam, and it flexed under the pressure in a way that made Mariana's breath cat. "This needs to be replaced before the first real storm, or it comes down on top of everything you have left to eat this winter." Mariana's arms tightened across her chest. She wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the pride she'd been rationing right alongside the grain. But her eyes kept drifting to the beam, to the way it gave beneath his hand like a held breath before a scream. "You noticed all that in one morning," she said. "I noticed all that in one look," William said. "I noticed all that in one look," William said quietly. "I told you. I know how to read a dying thing." Something passed between them then, not quite trust, not yet. But the first thread of it. Mariana looked at him the way a woman looks at a stray dog that's just proven it can hunt. Still wary. Still ready to send it away. but no longer quite so ready to close the door. "Show me," she said. "Show me the flue first." They worked side by side through the following days, and the estate began, slowly, to remember what it felt like to be tended. William rebuilt the flue with stone's pride from a collapsed outbuilding, his hands blistering, his breath fogging thick in the freezing air of the hearth room. Mariana hauled water, held braces steady, learned the language of joists and load-bearing walls faster than any noblewoman had business learning it. Her children, a boy of 7 with his mother's watchful eyes, a girl barely 5 who still sucked her thumb when the wind got loud, began trailing William's own too, as they'd always belonged to the same brood. By the 3rd evening, all 4 of them were curled together by the newly working hearth, and for the first time in longer than William could remember, his daughter fell asleep without crying. "Your wife," Mariana said one night, when the children were down and the fire cracked low between them. It wasn't quite a question. What happened to her? William's jaw tightened. He'd been waiting for someone to ask and dreading it in equal measure. Fever. 2 winters ago. I was in the capital, arguing with men who'd already decided to ruin me, men who called my designs reckless the same season they stripped my title and handed my commissions to their own sons. His voice roughened. I came home to bury her instead of save her. Mariana's expression didn't soften with pity, it sharpened with recognition. My husband went the same season, she said. Different reason. Same result. She stared into the fire like it might show her something. They said the estate would collapse without a man to run it. I think some of them were hoping it would. Easier to buy ruined land than to bargain with a widow who won't sell. They'd be fools to think you'd break, William said, and meant it. They're not fools, Mariana said. She looked up, and in the firelight her exhaustion looked less like weakness and more like armour, hard-worn and battle-tested. That's worse. William said nothing to that because nothing was reassuring he could offer that wouldn't be a lie. Instead, he reached for the next task, the way he always did when words failed him, checking the mortar on the wall beside them, testing it with his thumb, buying them both a moment of silence that didn't demand anything further. But something had shifted between them in the sharing of it. 2 people who had each buried a spouse to the same brutal season, each having been failed by the world in different but equally merciless ways, sitting now on the same side of a fight neither of them had asked for. By week's end, the flue drew clean, the grain store's foundation had been packed and raised, and the storehouse beam stood braced with fresh timber William had felled and shaped himself, hands raw, shoulders screaming, refusing to stop until the wood held. Mariana stood in the doorway and watched him drive the final peg home, and when he turned to face her, waiting almost bracing for her verdict, she didn't give him one in words. She simply nodded. And in that nod was every syllable of the week's unspoken bargain, honoured.
"You've earned the winter," she said. "Don't think that means you've earned my trust."
I wouldn't dream of it, William said. But something in the way she held his gaze a beat too long told him the trust was already further along than either of them wanted to admit. The riders came 4 days later, cutting black shapes across the white fields, and Mariana knew trouble before they'd even reached the gate. She recognized the seal on the lead rider's coat, the same house that had circled her land like carrion birds since the week her husband died, offering to relieve her of the burden of a duchy no widow could be expected to manage alone. She'd sent them away twice already. She had a feeling this visit wouldn't end so easily. Lady Mariana. The lead rider dismounted with the easy arrogance of a man who'd never once had to beg for anything. His eyes slid past her to William, standing at the storehouse with a hammer still in hand, and something flickered there, recognition, and beneath it, something colder. And the Duke Ashcroft. How convenient that you'd find shelter here of all places. State your business, Mariana said, or leave it at the gate.
"My business is concern," the rider said, smooth as poured oil. "Concern for a widow managing land far beyond her means, harboring a disgraced noble whose own estate collapsed under his stewardship. Tell me, my lady, do you know what became of his holdings before he arrived at yours?
William's hand tightened on the hammer's handle, but he said nothing. Let them think what they wanted. He'd learned the hard way that defending himself to men like this only fed the fire. I know he's rebuilt more of this estate in 2 weeks than your house has offered me in 2 years of concern, Mariana said, and her voice didn't waver. Say what you actually came to say. The rider's smile thinned. Sell, he said, dropping all pretense. Sell now, while the offer's generous, and while you can still walk away with something. Winter hasn't even shown its teeth yet, my lady. Wait much longer, and there won't be an offer left on the table, only a ruin no one wants, and a widow with nothing to bargain with. Mariana didn't answer right away. Behind her, she was aware of William going very still, the particular stillness of a man recognizing a threat he'd seen before, wearing a different coat. These are the same men, William said quietly, once the riders had turned their horses back down the frozen road, dust of snow kicking up behind them like a warning. Or men exactly like them. The ones who wanted my estate broken up before I'd even finished burying my wife. Mariana turned to him, and for the first time since he'd arrived at her gate, her guard didn't rise back into place. Then we'd better make certain, she said, that there's nothing left here for them to want. Behind them, the storehouse beam held steady against a wind that was only just beginning to learn how to howl, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the real storm was already gathering, patient as the men who had just ridden away, waiting for its moment to test everything they had built. The first real storm came on a Tuesday, and Ravensmoor held. William stood in the courtyard as the wind tore at the shutters, watching the flue draw smoke clean and steady through the chimney he'd rebuilt with his own blistered hands. The grain store's raised foundation kept the sacks dry above the floodline as snow melt pooled and froze at its edges. The storehouse beam held, braced and true, groaning under the weight of snowdrift, but never once threatening to give. It's working, Mariana said, coming to stand beside him, her breath fogging in the cold. There was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, not quite joy, but its distant, cautious cousin. 2 years of watching this place fail, and it's actually holding. Don't celebrate yet, William said, though a small, unfamiliar warmth moved through his chest at her words. He'd learned not to trust good news too quickly. Old habit. Old scar tissue. A storm this size is a test. It's not the exam. He was right to be wary. He found the leak 2 days later, quite by accident, while checking the reservoir that fed water to both the main house and the storehouse troughs. A hairline crack, low along the reservoir's stone wall, weeping water so slowly it had gone unnoticed for what must have been months. William crouched beside it, running his fingers along the damp stone, and felt the particular cold dread of a man realizing a slow problem was about to become a fast one. It's not urgent, he told Mariana that evening, though something in his tone must have betrayed him because her eyes narrowed. Not yet. But if the temperature keeps dropping the way it's dropping, that water will freeze inside the crack. Ice expands. It'll split the wall wide, and we'll lose the reservoir at the worst possible moment. How long do we have at the worst possible moment? How long do we have? I don't know, William admitted, and the honesty of it hung heavy in the room. Weeks, maybe. Or days, if the next storm's as bad as the sky says it will be. Mariana didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, toward the grey horizon where clouds were already beginning to gather thick and low, patient as the men who'd ridden away on black horses. Then we watch it, she said finally. And we pray it holds until you can fix it properly. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that prayer had a poor record lately of keeping anything standing. It was the children who noticed the change before either adult was willing to name it. William found his daughter one evening curled asleep in Mariana's lap instead of his own. Her small fist closed around a fold of the widow's burgundy skirt like an anchor. His son had taken to trailing Mariana's boy through every chore, the two of them stacking firewood and clearing snow from the stable paths with the easy rhythm of brothers who'd simply always existed. And Mariana's daughter Solemn, watchful, thumb permanently near her mouth, had started reaching for William's hand whenever the wind picked up outside, as though his presence alone were proof against the storm. "They've stopped asking when we're leaving," William said quietly, watching the four children share a single blanket by the hearth, a tangle of limbs and warmth that no longer sorted itself by whose blood belonged to whom. Should they be asking? Mariana said, and there was an edge beneath the question, careful and unsure, like she was testing ice she wasn't certain would bear her weight. William looked at her for a long moment. The firelight caught the exhaustion still etched permanently beneath her eyes, but also something else now, something softer, something that hadn't been there the night he'd first knocked on her gate. "No," he said finally. "I don't think they should." It wasn't a declaration. Neither of them was ready for declarations, not with grief still fresh enough to flinch at, not with a duchy still balanced on the edge of ruin. But it was an admission, quiet and dangerous in its own right, that whatever had begun as a trade of labour for milk had become something neither of them had bargained for. Something that made the thought of the roads reopening in spring feel less like freedom and more like loss. That night, William caught himself watching Mariana across the room the way he used to watch, load-bearing walls searching for the places she might be weaker than she let on, the cracks she was too proud to name aloud. He didn't like how much he wanted to be the one who reinforced them. He didn't have long to sit with the feeling. 3 days later, the sky over Ravensmoor turned the colour of a bruise, and the wind began to scream. The blizzard that struck that week would be spoken of in the region for a generation. The kind of storm old men measured other winters against for the rest of their lives. It arrived without the courtesy of a warning. 1 hour the sky was merely grey. The next, snow fell sideways in sheets thick enough to erase the tree line, the stable, the gatehouse, the whole world beyond arm's reach dissolving into howling white. The temperature plummeted so fast that water left standing in buckets froze solid before the hour was out. Every road leading to Ravensmoor vanished beneath drifts taller than a grown man. "No one's coming," Mariana said, watching from the window as the last visible landmark, the crooked old oak by the gate, disappeared into the whiteout. "Not the rivals. Not a physician if we needed one. Not anyone." "Then it's just us," William said. It was always going to come down to just us. They spent that first night reinforcing everything they could reach, packing snow against the base of the walls for insulation, checking every joint and beam William had repaired over the past weeks, feeding the children extra portions of the dwindling grain because a full belly was the only defence against the cold that a small body had. The 4 children slept piled together like a litter of pups, and for once, neither William nor Mariana pretended that arrangement was anything but exactly right. It was near midnight, with the wind screaming loud enough to rattle the shutters in their frames, that William heard it a groan low and long, carrying from the direction of the storehouse. A sound he recognised instantly, in his bones, from a lifetime spent listening to buildings confess their weaknesses before they failed completely. He was out the door before Mariana had finished asking what was wrong. The storehouse beam, the one he'd braced with his own hands only weeks before, had held against the season's first storm. It was not holding now. Snow load beyond anything William had accounted for had built across the roof in the hours since dusk, and the reservoir crack he'd been watching, the slow, patient leak he'd hoped would wait for spring, had finally frozen and split wide open, sending a slow flood of water seeping straight toward the storehouse foundation. Wet stone. Frozen beam. A weight the structure was never built to bear, all converging in the same brutal hour. "The beam's failing," William shouted when Mariana caught up to him at the storehouse door, a lantern gripped white-knuckled in her fist against a wind, trying to tear it from her hands. "If it goes, the roof comes down on top of the grain. Everything we have left for winter gone in one night." "Then stop it," Mariana said, and there was no question in her voice, only command. Only the same iron that had kept this duchy alive for 2 years before William ever arrived at her gate. I need to get into the attic space and drive new supports before the beam gives entirely. William was already moving, already stripping off his outer coat because it would only weigh him down climbing. I need someone to guide me. I won't be able to see or hear anything up there past this wind. I need you in the courtyard, watching the angle of that roof line, telling me exactly where it's shifting. You'll freeze up there. I'll freeze faster if that roof comes down on my head, William said, and something in the grim set of his jaw told her arguing further would only cost them time neither of them had. He climbed. The attic space was a coffin of freezing dark, wind screaming through gaps in the roofline that hadn't existed that morning. Snow already drifting in fine and sharp as glass across his hands as he crawled toward the failing beam. Below, in the wind-torn courtyard, Mariana stood with the lantern raised, her voice the only tether keeping him oriented in a world gone entirely white and black and roaring. "Left!" she screamed, over the wind, watching the roofline flex and buckle from below. It's sagging on the roofline flex and buckle from below. It's sagging on the left. Hurry, William, it's giving way. He drove the first support home with numb hands, wood biting deep into wood, and felt the beam shudder beneath him like something alive and dying. Mariana's voice came again, sharper, more frightened than she'd allowed herself to sound in front of him until now, and something in that fear reached him even through the roaring dark, steadied him, because it meant she needed him to come down from this roof alive, not just successful. The second support went in as the beam let out a groan that shook snow loose from every rafter around him. "It's not holding." Mariana's voice, raw now, desperate. "William, get out." "One more," he shouted back, though he wasn't certain she could hear him over the storm. "One more, and it holds through the winter." He drove the third peg home with everything he had left, shoulder screaming, hands past feeling entirely, and for one terrible suspended second, nothing happened at all. The wind howled. The beam held its silence. And then slowly, groaning like something exhausted finally allowed to rest, it settled. Steadied. Held. William half fell, half climbed his way back down through the trapdoor, and the moment his boots hit solid ground, Mariana was there, gripping his frozen hands in hers like she meant to warm the life back into them through will alone. "It held," she said, and her voice cracked on the words, relief and terror tangled together into something that sounded almost like a sob. "It held," William agreed, and before either of them had decided to allow it, her forehead was pressed against his chest, and his arms were around her, both of them shaking from cold, from fear, from something that had nothing to do with either. The storm broke 3 days later, as suddenly as it had arrived, the wind dying to stillness, the sky clearing to a hard, brilliant blue that made the snowfields glitter like speckled glass. Ravensmoor stood. The storehouse beam held beneath its burden of snow. The grain stores sat dry and whole, untouched by rot or ruin. The children spilled out into the courtyard the moment the drifts allowed it, 4 voices raised together in the particular delighted shrieking of children who had survived something enormous without ever fully understanding how close it had come to swallowing them. The rivals returned within the week, their black horses picking a careful path through the melting snow, and this time it was William who met them at the gate, no longer a beggar in a threadbare cloak, but a man standing on ground he'd rebuilt with his own 2 hands. "I trust the concern has been addressed," William said, before the lead rider had even dismounted. "The duchy stands. The harvest is secure. And the widow you've been circling for 2 years has an architect, a partner, and a household now strong enough to weather considerably worse than your offers." The rider's jaw tightened. He looked past William to Mariana, standing in the courtyard with her children gathered close, and found in her face none of the exhaustion he'd been counting on to eventually break her. "You'll find nothing left here to buy," Mariana said. "Not this season. Not any season after it." The riders left, and this time William understood they would not return. That evening, with the children finally asleep and the fire burning warm and steady in a hearth that no longer bled its heat into the walls, William found Mariana standing at the window, watching the last of the sunset burn gold across the snow. "We survived it," she said. "We did more than survive it," William said, coming to stand beside her. "We built something. Together. I didn't come here looking for that. I came here for milk and a roof." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since he'd arrived at her gate with nothing but a broken cart and a desperate plea, there was no exhaustion in his expression at all, only certainty. "But I'm not walking back out into the spring roads alone. Not if you'll have me stay." Mariana didn't answer with words. She simply reached for his hand, still scarred from splinters and frost, and held it the way she'd held it in the storm, like it was something worth anchoring to, something worth keeping.
Outside, the last of the Ashcroft storm melted quietly into the ground, and Ravensmoor, for the first time in 2 long years, belonged fully to the people determined to keep it standing.
If you were the widow standing in that courtyard, watching a stranger arrive at your gate with nothing but a promise and 2 starving children, would you have taken the bargain? Tell me in the comments, would you have trusted him that first night, or waited for the storm to prove him right? And if this is the kind of love that gets built 1 broken beam at a time, 1 honest confession at a time, don't let the story end here. Follow the channel, because the next duchy, the next storm, the next impossible bargain is already waiting for you.